Something just exploded inside the WNBA, and the league might not recover if this keeps going. For months, fans were told that the future of women's basketball had never looked brighter. New arenas were filling up. Television ratings were exploding. Billion-dollar media deals were finally landing on the table. And for the first time in decades, the WNBA wasn't fighting for attention anymore, it was commanding it. But just as the league reached its biggest breakthrough moment, a completely different story started brewing behind the scenes. One that most fans never saw coming. And when veteran journalist Ramona Shelburne finally spoke about what was really happening inside the league, the reaction across the basketball world was immediate. Because what she revealed wasn't just a normal contract negotiation. It exposed a growing standoff between players and owners that could reshape the entire future of the sport. A fight over money, a fight over control, and most importantly, a fight over timing. The WNBA is entering what should be the most important era in its history. Massive media companies are preparing to broadcast games to millions of new viewers. Expansion teams are preparing to bring the league into brand new cities. And a wave of superstar talent is entering the league right as fan interest is exploding. Everything was lining up perfectly, until negotiations suddenly turned into a standoff. Now the calendar is moving forward, the next season is approaching, and two sides that are supposed to build the future of women's basketball together are instead locked in one of the most intense labor battles the league has ever seen. And the most shocking part, this conflict didn't appear overnight. According to reports and insider conversations around the league, this situation has been building quietly for years, and when Ramona Shelburne finally pulled back the curtain, it revealed just how fragile the league's biggest moment might actually be. Because what looks like a simple disagreement over contracts might actually be something far bigger. Something that could determine whether the WNBA's historic growth continues, or whether the league accidentally stalls its own momentum at the exact moment the entire sports world is finally paying attention. And once you understand how this story actually started, the situation becomes even more complicated. Because the first sign that something serious was happening didn't come from a press conference. It came from a single conversation that suddenly changed how people inside the basketball world were looking at the WNBA. When Ramona Shelburne began discussing the WNBA's labor situation during a recent conversation about the league's future, most fans expected a typical update about negotiations. After all, contract talks between leagues and players happen all the time in professional sports. The NBA has them. The NFL has them. Major League Baseball goes through them constantly. Usually, they stay behind closed doors. Sometimes a few details leak out. Eventually both sides compromise, a new agreement is signed, and the season moves forward like nothing happened. But this time felt different. Because instead of describing a routine negotiation, Shelburne hinted that something far more complicated was unfolding behind the scenes. What she described was not simply a disagreement over salary numbers or contract terms. It was a situation where the entire league was approaching a critical moment, while the people responsible for running it were still trying to figure out how the next chapter would actually work. And the timing of this couldn't be more dramatic. The WNBA is heading into a season that could define the future of the league. Television networks are preparing for expanded coverage. New markets are entering the league. Fan interest is reaching levels the sport has never seen before. In other words, everything is supposed to be accelerating. But instead of celebrating that momentum, league officials and players are currently sitting across negotiating tables trying to figure out something far more fundamental: how the money generated by this new era will actually be divided. At the center of the conversation is the collective bargaining agreement, the document that defines everything from player salaries to revenue sharing to contract structures. And the current agreement is reaching its breaking point. Without a new deal in place, the entire financial structure of the league enters uncertain territory. That means teams don't know exactly what salary caps will look like. Players don't know how future contracts will be structured. And front offices are left trying to plan seasons without knowing what rules they'll be operating under. In most leagues, these kinds of negotiations happen quietly months before they become urgent. But in the WNBA's case, the pressure is building right as the league prepares for one of the most important seasons in its history. Which is why Shelburne's comments immediately grabbed the attention of fans, analysts, and executives across the sports world. Because the question suddenly became impossible to ignore. What happens if this doesn't get resolved in time? The WNBA has already released its upcoming season schedule. Arenas have been reserved. Broadcast partners are preparing their coverage plans. Fans in multiple cities are already buying tickets. From the outside, everything looks ready to go. But behind the scenes, the people responsible for building the league's future are still negotiating the rules that will determine how the entire system works. And that's where the tension starts to grow. Because the players believe the league is entering a new era of profitability. And the owners believe the business still needs time to stabilize before making dramatic financial changes. Both sides believe they are protecting the future of the league. But both sides are also holding firm on positions that could determine how quickly that future arrives. And the closer the calendar moves toward the start of the next season, the more intense that standoff becomes. Which raises a question that nobody inside the WNBA can ignore anymore. Is this simply a difficult negotiation? Or is the league approaching a moment where the fight over its future could become just as important as the games themselves? Because once you understand how this conflict started and why the timing of it is so unusual, the entire situation suddenly becomes even more dramatic. And that's where the Real story begins to unfold. But the timing of this battle might actually be the most shocking part of all. Because this fight isn't happening during a struggling era for the league. It's happening during the biggest growth moment the WNBA has ever experienced. And that is where everything gets complicated. What makes this entire situation so difficult to understand isn't just the negotiation itself. Professional sports leagues negotiate labor deals all the time. What makes this moment different is when it's happening. Because the WNBA isn't entering a period of uncertainty or decline. It's entering the exact opposite. The league is stepping into what could easily become the most important growth era in its entire history. For decades, the WNBA fought to build its place in the sports world. The league launched with massive expectations back in 1997, but the reality of building a new professional sports league is always brutal. Attendance fluctuated. Media attention came and went. And while loyal fans stayed committed to the sport, the league constantly had to fight for visibility in a crowded sports landscape dominated by older, more established leagues. Year after year, players kept competing. Owners kept investing. Executives kept searching for ways to expand the audience. Sometimes the progress felt slow. Sometimes it felt like the league was constantly one step away from the breakthrough moment that would finally push women's basketball fully into the mainstream sports conversation. And then suddenly, that moment arrived. The past few seasons have brought a level of attention to the WNBA that even longtime supporters admit they hadn't seen before. Crowds began growing in arenas across the country. Social media engagement started exploding. Highlights from WNBA games were circulating through sports media in ways that rarely happened before. And as new fans began discovering the league, the business side of the sport began transforming as well. Corporate sponsors started paying closer attention. Broadcast networks saw an opportunity to bring a rapidly growing audience onto their platforms. And suddenly the WNBA wasn't just surviving anymore. It was expanding. That expansion became official when the league secured one of the most important business agreements in its history. A massive long-term media rights deal involving some of the largest companies in the entire entertainment industry. Major networks and streaming platforms, including companies with global reach, agreed to broadcast WNBA games for the next decade. This wasn't just another television contract. It was a signal to the entire sports industry that women's basketball had officially entered a new era. For the first time in league history, the WNBA had secured a media deal that placed it alongside major professional leagues in terms of long-term broadcast stability. That deal doesn't just bring more games to television. It brings more exposure, more advertising revenue, more investment opportunities, more sponsorship deals, and perhaps most importantly, more fans. In sports, visibility changes everything. The more people see the games, the more invested they become in the teams, the players, and the rivalries that define the league. And for the WNBA, this media agreement represented something incredibly important. Momentum. The league had finally reached the point where its growth wasn't theoretical anymore. It was measurable. Ratings were climbing. Attendance numbers were rising. Merchandise sales were increasing. Digital engagement was breaking previous records. And just as all of this progress was happening, the labor negotiations reached their most intense phase. That's the part that makes insiders around the league nervous. Because the upcoming season isn't just another year of basketball. It's the launch point of this entire new era. The media partners who signed that massive broadcast agreement are preparing to introduce the WNBA to millions of viewers who may have never watched a game before. Networks are planning expanded coverage. Streaming platforms are preparing new promotional campaigns. Sports shows are building segments around the league's rising stars. Everything is lining up for what could be a historic moment. But that historic moment depends on one simple thing. The league has to actually start the season smoothly. And that's where the pressure starts building. Because negotiations between players and owners haven't fully settled yet. Both sides want to reach an agreement that reflects the new financial reality of the sport. Players believe the growing revenue should translate into higher salaries and a larger share of the league's earnings. Owners argue that the business side of the league still requires careful financial planning before making dramatic increases. Neither side is necessarily wrong. But the calendar doesn't care who wins the argument. The calendar keeps moving. And every day that passes without a finalized agreement brings the league one step closer to a situation that nobody wants to face. A season approaching without full clarity about the financial rules that govern it. Inside professional sports, these negotiations are often compared to a high-stakes poker game. Both sides are trying to determine how much leverage they really have. Players want to push for the best possible deal while the league's value is rising. Owners want to avoid committing to numbers that could become unsustainable long-term. But unlike poker, there's one factor neither side can control. Time. Training camps have to open. Teams have to finalize rosters. Schedules have to be honored. Broadcast networks have to prepare coverage. And fans who bought tickets expect to see actual basketball games being played. The closer the league gets to the start of the season, the more intense that pressure becomes. Because if negotiations drag on too long, the problem stops being about contracts. It becomes about logistics. Entire operational timelines begin to collapse. Front offices can't make long-term roster decisions without knowing what salary structures look like. Agents can't negotiate deals for players without knowing the financial. Strip away all the headlines, all the rumors, all the emotional reactions from fans, and the entire conflict inside the WNBA eventually comes down to one central question. How much of the league's money should go to the players? That question might sound simple. But in professional sports, it's one of the most complicated and most explosive negotiations that can exist. Because when a league begins growing rapidly, the conversation about money changes immediately. Players look at rising television deals, increasing ticket sales, and expanding sponsorships and ask a very direct question. If the league is earning more money than ever before, shouldn't the athletes on the court receive a larger share of that success? On the other side of the table, league executives and owners are looking at the same numbers through a completely different lens. They see years, sometimes decades, of financial losses that had to be absorbed while the league slowly built its audience. They see operating costs, travel expenses, marketing investments, and arena agreements that must be paid regardless of how many fans are watching. And when they analyze future revenue projections, they often move cautiously, preferring stability over sudden changes that could create financial pressure later. That's why labor negotiations in sports almost always revolve around one key concept: revenue sharing. How the total income generated by the league gets divided between the organization itself and the players who compete in it. In many major sports leagues, this structure has already been established for years. The NBA, for example, operates with a revenue-sharing model that gives players roughly half of basketball-related income. The NFL and NHL follow similar frameworks. Those agreements didn't appear overnight. They were built through years of negotiations, disputes, compromises, and sometimes painful labor battles that reshaped the entire business structure of those leagues. The WNBA, however, is still evolving through that process. For most of its existence, the league operated in a completely different financial environment than those larger sports organizations. It was still growing, still developing its audience, still building the commercial foundation needed to support long-term profitability. Because of that reality, the early labor agreements between players and the league were structured more cautiously. Salaries grew gradually. Revenue-sharing models remained limited. And both sides understood that the sport was still in the process of building its economic engine. But now that engine is finally starting to accelerate. The league's visibility has increased dramatically. The media rights deal for the upcoming era signals that the WNBA's commercial value is rising. And that shift is exactly why the current negotiation has become so intense. Reports around the league suggest that players want the next agreement to significantly increase their share of revenue generated by the sport. They believe the WNBA has entered a new financial phase, one where the athletes responsible for the product should benefit more directly from the league's growth. From their perspective, This moment represents a rare opportunity. If the league is about to experience its biggest financial expansion ever, the players want to make sure the new agreement reflects that reality. Waiting too long to adjust the revenue structure could mean missing the moment entirely. But from the ownership side, the situation looks more complicated. While the league is clearly growing, many executives argue that the WNBA is still stabilizing financially. They believe the new media rights agreement and rising fan interest will increase revenue significantly over the next decade. But they also believe those gains should be evaluated carefully over time. In other words, owners want to avoid making dramatic financial commitments based purely on projections. They prefer to see how the business evolves during the next few seasons before locking in major structural changes. And that philosophical difference is exactly where negotiations become difficult. Because both sides believe they are protecting the future of the league. Players believe they are ensuring that athletes receive fair compensation as the sport expands. Owners believe they are protecting long-term sustainability by avoiding sudden financial pressure. Neither side wants to lose. Neither side wants to give up leverage too early. And when both sides dig in, the negotiating table can become a battlefield of patience. Weeks turn into months. Offers are exchanged, rejected, and revised. Public statements become more careful. Behind closed doors, tension grows. Fans rarely see these details while they are unfolding. But when journalists like Ramona Shelburne begin discussing the situation publicly, it's often a sign that negotiations have reached a critical stage. Because once a labor story starts spreading through sports media, the pressure on both sides increases dramatically. Players begin hearing from fans who support their push for better compensation. Owners face questions from sponsors and business partners wondering how the situation will resolve. And the closer the league gets to the start of a new season, the more everyone involved realizes that time is becoming the most powerful factor in the entire negotiation. Eventually, someone has to make the next move. But the problem with high-stakes negotiations is that nobody wants to blink first. Because blinking can look like weakness. And in professional sports, weakness can cost millions of dollars. Which is why the WNBA now finds itself in a situation where both sides are waiting for the other to compromise. Players are pushing for a deal that reflects the league's rising value. Owners are holding firm on financial structures they believe will protect long-term stability. And while those conversations continue behind closed doors, the rest of the league is quietly preparing for a season that could arrive faster than anyone expected. But the financial battle isn't the only reason people inside the sport are worried. Because something else has been happening over the past 2 seasons that completely changed the WNBA's trajectory. Something that turned the league from a growing sports property into a genuine cultural moment. And that moment revolves around one player whose impact has been impossible to ignore. Because the rise of a single superstar has suddenly made the stakes of this negotiation even higher. And once you understand that part of the story, you begin to realize why so many people around the league are starting to feel nervous about how this situation might unfold. If this negotiation was happening 5 years ago, the conversation around the WNBA would probably feel very different. Fans would still care. Players would still fight for better salaries. Owners would still protect the long-term business. But the pressure surrounding this moment wouldn't feel nearly as intense. Because 5 years ago, the league was still building its audience step by step. Today, the situation is completely different. And the reason for that shift can largely be traced back to one moment that changed the entire sports conversation almost overnight. The arrival of Caitlin Clark. When Clark entered the WNBA after her historic college career, expectations were already massive. She had broken scoring records in college basketball. Her games regularly drew millions of viewers. A new generation of fans had followed her journey from the NCAA tournament straight into the professional league. But even with those expectations, very few people predicted just how dramatic the impact would actually become. Because Clark didn't just arrive in the WNBA. She ignited it. Almost immediately, the entire league began experiencing a level of attention that had never existed before. Road arenas that normally held steady crowds suddenly started selling out weeks in advance whenever Clark's team appeared on the schedule. Fans who had never watched a WNBA game before were suddenly tuning in. Sports media shows that had rarely discussed women's basketball were now debating her performances daily. Highlights from WNBA games began circulating across social media at a speed that surprised even league executives. The numbers told the story clearly. Television viewership increased dramatically. Attendance records were shattered across multiple arenas. Merchandise sales surged. And for the first time in years, the WNBA wasn't just gaining new fans. It was gaining casual sports fans. That difference matters more than people realize. Hardcore fans stay with a sport through good seasons and bad seasons. Casual fans are different. They arrive when something exciting happens. A superstar appears. A rivalry forms. A moment captures the public imagination. And while casual fans can bring incredible energy to a league, they are also incredibly fragile. If the excitement disappears, they disappear too. That's why the timing of this labor battle suddenly feels so dangerous to people inside the WNBA. Because the league finally has the one thing it spent decades trying to build: momentum. And momentum in sports is incredibly difficult to create, but even harder to maintain. Clark's rookie season became one of the most talked about introductions in modern basketball. She broke records. She created viral moments. She brought massive crowds into arenas across the country. And suddenly, the WNBA found itself in a position it had never experienced before. The league had become part of the mainstream sports conversation. Nightly sports shows were discussing WNBA highlights. Major brands began exploring sponsorship opportunities. Ticket demand exploded in cities that previously struggled to fill seats. And perhaps most importantly, the league discovered that millions of new fans were finally paying attention. That's the type of momentum that can change an entire sport. But there's a hidden truth about momentum that experienced executives understand very well. It can disappear just as quickly as it arrives. If fans tune in expecting exciting games and find chaos instead, they lose interest. If the league looks disorganized or uncertain, casual viewers move on to something else. Sports history is full of leagues that captured public attention for a brief moment, but failed to hold it long enough to build a lasting foundation. That's why people around the WNBA are watching the current negotiations so closely. Because the league's growth is no longer theoretical. It's happening right now. And Clark isn't the only reason excitement around the sport is growing. A new generation of stars is entering the league. Young players with massive college followings are bringing entire fan bases with them. Veteran superstars are entering the prime of their careers. Expansion teams are preparing to introduce the WNBA to brand new markets. Everything is aligned for what could become the most exciting era the league has ever experienced. Which is exactly why this labor conflict feels so risky. Because it's happening during the most important window of opportunity the sport has ever had. For decades, people inside women's basketball believed that if the league could just reach this moment, if it could capture the attention of mainstream sports fans, everything would begin accelerating. Now that moment has arrived. And instead of celebrating it, the league is trying to navigate one of the most delicate negotiations in its history. Players want their share of the growth they helped create. Owners want to ensure the business side of the sport remains stable. Both sides believe they are protecting the future. But the future they are protecting is happening right now. Which raises a question that nobody inside the WNBA wants to answer publicly. What happens if this momentum stalls? What happens if the fans who just discovered the league suddenly see headlines about disputes instead of highlights? What happens if the season arrives surrounded by uncertainty instead of excitement? Because sports fans have endless entertainment options. If one league looks unstable, they simply move on to the next game. And that's why the current moment feels so fragile. The WNBA has finally reached a point where millions of new fans are paying attention. The sport is growing faster than ever. The opportunity to transform women's basketball into a permanent mainstream sports powerhouse is sitting right in front of the league. But the same momentum that created this opportunity is also creating pressure. Pressure to resolve negotiations quickly. Pressure to launch the next season smoothly. Pressure to make sure the excitement surrounding the sport continues instead of fading away. Because the league has finally discovered something incredibly powerful. A superstar who can bring millions of people into the sport. And once a league experiences that kind of breakthrough, the biggest challenge becomes protecting it. But there's another factor in this story that makes the situation even more complicated. Because while the WNBA is trying to manage explosive growth, it's also expanding into brand new cities at the exact same time. An expansion brings a completely different set of challenges that could make this entire situation even more unpredictable. While negotiations continue behind closed doors, something else is happening that makes this entire situation even more complicated. The WNBA isn't just preparing for another season. It's expanding. 2 brand new franchises are entering the league, Toronto and Portland, marking one of the most ambitious growth moves the WNBA has made in years. Expansion in professional sports is always treated as a celebration. It means the league believes its future is strong enough to support more teams, more markets, and more fans. New cities get their first taste of professional basketball. Local sponsors rush to attach their brands to the excitement. Fans who have waited years for a franchise finally get a team to call their own. In theory, expansion represents confidence. But in practice, it also introduces enormous pressure. Because building a new professional team isn't something that happens overnight. It requires careful planning. Front offices must be assembled. Coaching staffs must be hired. Players must be drafted or signed. Marketing campaigns must launch to introduce the team to its community. Arena schedules must be coordinated. Merchandise must be produced. Broadcast partnerships must be finalized. In other words, expansion teams are complex operations that normally require months, sometimes years, of preparation. And in the WNBA's case, those preparations are happening at the same time the league is trying to finalize one of the most important labor agreements in its history. That creates a strange situation. On one hand, the league is telling the world it's growing. On the other hand, the financial framework governing that growth is still being negotiated. For Toronto and Portland, the excitement surrounding their arrival is real. Both cities have passionate basketball communities. Both markets represent opportunities to introduce the WNBA to entirely new audiences. Fans are already imagining what their first seasons will look like. But behind the scenes, executives in those organizations are watching the ongoing negotiations very carefully, because the outcome of the labor agreement will directly influence how their teams are built. Salary caps determine how much money teams can spend on players. Contract structures affect how long players stay with their teams. Roster rules influence how front offices assemble competitive lineups. Without clarity on those rules, expansion teams are essentially trying to prepare for a season without knowing exactly what system they'll be operating in. That uncertainty doesn't just affect the new franchises. It affects the entire league. Every general manager in the WNBA is waiting to see how the final agreement will shape roster decisions. Every player entering free agency wants to understand what the new financial landscape will look like. Every agent negotiating contracts is trying to predict what the final numbers will be. When a new CBA is finalized, those answers usually appear quickly. But until that agreement is signed, everyone involved in the league is operating in a kind of temporary holding pattern. For expansion teams, that holding pattern can feel especially uncomfortable. These franchises are entering the league during what should be a celebratory moment. Instead, they are stepping into an environment where the future rules of the sport are still being debated. It's like opening a brand new restaurant while the entire food industry is rewriting the rules about how businesses operate. You know the opportunity is huge, but you also know the uncertainty could change everything. And yet, despite those challenges, expansion remains one of the most important signs of the WNBA's progress. Because leagues don't add teams unless they believe demand is growing. New markets mean new fans. New sponsors, new television audiences, new energy surrounding the sport. For years, critics questioned whether the WNBA could expand successfully. Now the league is answering that question with action. Toronto and Portland represent the beginning of what many believe could be a larger expansion era. Other cities are already watching closely. If these franchises succeed, more markets could follow. But expansion only works when the league itself feels stable. Fans in new cities want to believe they are joining a thriving organization. Sponsors want to invest in something that looks confident and organized. Broadcast partners want to promote games that feel exciting and important. If the league launches expansion during a period of uncertainty, that excitement can quickly turn into hesitation. Which is why the current negotiations are being watched so closely by people far beyond the players and owners themselves. Investors are watching. Sponsors are watching. Media partners are watching. Even other professional sports leagues are paying attention to how the WNBA handles this moment. Because what happens during the next few months will shape how the league is perceived for years. If negotiations conclude smoothly and the season launches successfully, the WNBA could ride its current momentum into a completely new level of popularity. But if delays, confusion, or instability dominate the headlines, the league risks sending a very different message. A message that suggests the sport is still struggling to manage its own growth. And that's the last thing anyone inside the WNBA wants. Because for the first time in its history, the league is no longer fighting to prove that women's basketball deserves attention. It already has that attention. Now the challenge is proving that the league is ready to handle it. But even with expansion excitement building and new markets preparing to welcome teams, the biggest question surrounding the WNBA still hasn't been answered. The question every player, owner, executive, and fan is quietly waiting to see resolved. Who is going to blink first? Because as the season approaches, the standoff between players and owners is reaching the point where patience alone may not be enough to solve the problem. And once negotiations reach that stage, the next move becomes incredibly important. At some point in every negotiation, something changes. Early on, both sides feel like they have time. Meetings can be scheduled weeks apart. Proposals can be carefully studied. Lawyers and financial analysts can spend days reviewing every line of a potential agreement. But eventually the calendar starts closing in. And when that happens, time becomes the most powerful force in the room. That's exactly where the WNBA finds itself right now. Because the league's schedule has already been released. The opening games are already set. Fans are already making plans to attend. But the system that governs how teams operate, the financial framework that determines contracts, salaries, and roster construction, is still being finalized. In professional sports, that creates a situation executives sometimes call calendar pressure. The closer a league gets to opening night, the harder it becomes to delay decisions. Teams need to build rosters. Players need to sign contracts. Training camps need to open. Marketing campaigns need to launch. Broadcast networks need to prepare production schedules. All of those things depend on the league having a finalized structure in place. Without that structure, the entire operation slows down. And that's why insiders around the WNBA are quietly watching the calendar very carefully. Because there are several major milestones that must happen before the season begins. The expansion draft must take place so the new franchises can build their rosters. Free agency needs to open so players can sign contracts with teams. The WNBA draft must happen so incoming rookies can begin their professional careers. Training camps must begin so players can practice with their new teams. And all of those events depend on one thing: a finalized collective bargaining agreement. Without it, the league is essentially trying to run a professional sports season without knowing the financial rules that govern it. Now, this doesn't mean the season will automatically collapse if negotiations take longer than expected. Leagues often find ways to adjust timelines when agreements take longer to finalize. But adjustments create complications. Front offices must rush decisions. Players must relocate quickly. Teams must assemble rosters in shorter time frames. And when everything happens at once, mistakes become almost inevitable. Imagine building an entire professional basketball team in just a few days. Players signing contracts at the last minute. Coaches trying to organize training camps with athletes they barely had time to meet. General managers scrambling to balance salaries while learning the final rules of the new agreement. It's not impossible, but it's far from ideal. And when a league is entering one of the most important seasons in its history, far from ideal is not the situation anyone wants. The pressure doesn't only come from inside the league either. The WNBA's new media partners are preparing for the beginning of their massive broadcasting era. Television producers are designing coverage plans. Marketing departments are promoting upcoming matchups. Networks are preparing to introduce millions of viewers to the league. They are expecting a season that launches smoothly. A season filled with star players, sold-out arenas, and exciting storylines. What they don't want is uncertainty. In sports media, timing matters. If a season launches cleanly, networks can promote it confidently. But if the league appears disorganized or unstable, broadcasters suddenly find themselves explaining problems instead of celebrating the sport. And that's why executives across the WNBA understand how delicate this moment is. Because the league has worked incredibly hard to reach this stage. The growth of women's basketball didn't happen overnight. Players spent years competing in front of smaller crowds while building the sport's reputation. Owners invested millions of dollars to keep the league operating while the audience gradually expanded. Fans supported the league through seasons where national attention was difficult to earn. Now the sport has finally reached a point where the spotlight is shining brighter than ever. But spotlights can be unforgiving. When everything is going well, the attention feels exciting. When problems appear, that same attention can magnify every mistake. And that's the challenge the WNBA now faces. Two sides negotiating what they believe is the right future for the league, while the entire sports world watches the calendar move closer to opening night. Every day that passes increases the pressure. Every day without a finalized agreement raises more questions. Eventually, someone will have to take the next step. Because negotiations like this rarely end with both sides perfectly satisfied. They end with compromise. And the moment that compromise arrives could determine how the next era of the WNBA begins. But before that moment happens, there's one final question that continues to linger over the entire situation. A question that many people inside the sport are asking quietly behind closed doors. If this negotiation drags on too long, who actually pays the biggest price? Because the answer might not be the players. And it might not be the owners either. The real cost of this battle could fall on something much bigger. The future momentum of the entire league. And that realization is what makes the final stage of this story so important. By now, the situation inside the WNBA has become something bigger than a simple labor negotiation. It has become a test. A test of leadership. A test of timing. And perhaps most importantly, a test of whether the league can protect the momentum it spent decades trying to build. Because at the center of every major sports dispute, there is always one uncomfortable truth that both sides eventually have to confront. Someone always loses. Sometimes it's the players. Sometimes it's the owners. But in moments like this, the biggest loss can fall somewhere else entirely. It can fall on the fans. Think about the millions of people who discovered the WNBA during the past few seasons. Many of them weren't lifelong followers of the league. They were casual sports fans who suddenly became curious. They saw highlights spreading across social media. They watched sold-out arenas erupt when superstar players hit big shots. They heard commentators talking about women's basketball in ways that felt completely different from the past. And slowly, curiosity turned into interest. Interest turned into attention. Attention turned into support. That kind of growth is incredibly valuable. But it's also incredibly fragile. Casual fans don't always stay loyal during chaos. If the league appears unstable, those fans simply drift away. They return to the NBA playoffs. They watch another sport. They follow the next big story capturing national attention. In other words, they move on. That's why the stakes of this negotiation go far beyond salaries or revenue percentages. Because what's really at risk is the league's credibility during the most important growth moment in its history. The WNBA has finally reached a point where millions of new people are paying attention. The sport is trending upward. The business side is expanding. The media coverage is increasing. Everything that players, executives, and fans hoped for over the past 25 years is finally happening. And moments like that don't appear often. In professional sports, opportunities arrive in waves. A superstar appears. A new generation of talent emerges. A media deal increases exposure. For a brief period of time, the sport becomes part of the national conversation. But those waves don't last forever. If a league fails to ride that momentum forward, the spotlight eventually moves somewhere else. And rebuilding that attention can take years. People inside women's basketball understand this reality very clearly. They know how long it took to reach this point. They know how many players helped build the league through seasons where national attention was hard to find. They know how many investors believed in the sport before the business numbers made sense. That history is the reason this moment feels so important. Because the WNBA finally has the ingredients for a major breakthrough. Superstar players, massive media exposure, expansion into new cities, growing fan engagement. Everything needed to elevate the sport to another level is sitting right in front of the league. But success in sports is rarely guaranteed. Even when all the pieces are in place, the outcome still depends on decisions made behind closed doors. And right now, those decisions are being negotiated. Players want their fair share of a rapidly growing league. Owners want to protect the financial stability of the business they invested in. Both sides believe they are defending the future of the sport. But if the disagreement stretches too far, the future they are fighting over could become harder to protect. Because momentum in sports is like a window. When it opens, everything becomes possible. But if that window closes before the opportunity is used, the moment can disappear. And that's why the next few weeks inside the WNBA are so important. Because eventually someone will blink. Eventually a compromise will emerge. Eventually the agreement that shapes the next era of the league will be signed. The only question is how quickly that moment arrives. And whether it arrives before the pressure surrounding the league becomes something bigger than anyone expected. Because once the season begins, the focus should be on the basketball. The rivalries. The superstar performances. The moments that make fans fall in love with the sport. Not the negotiations that almost disrupted it. But until that agreement is finalized, the entire league is living in a moment of uncertainty. A moment where the future of women's basketball is being debated across conference tables instead of on the court. And the outcome of that debate could shape the next decade of the WNBA. Right now, the WNBA is standing at one of the most delicate moments in its entire history. Not because the league is struggling, not because the sport is losing fans, but because for the first time in decades, the WNBA is finally winning. Winning attention, winning new audiences, winning media deals, winning cultural relevance. And strangely enough, success can sometimes create the biggest challenges. Because when a league suddenly becomes valuable, every decision around that value becomes more intense. Players begin to realize their importance to the product. Owners begin protecting the investments they spent years building. Sponsors want stability. Broadcast partners want consistency. Fans want excitement. And all of those expectations suddenly collide in the same place. The negotiating table. For the players, this moment represents an opportunity that may not come again anytime soon. The league's popularity is rising. Revenue projections are increasing. And athletes across the WNBA believe that the next agreement should reflect the true value of the sport they helped build. Many of them spent years playing in a league that didn't receive the attention it deserved. Years where national headlines were rare. Years where players competed for respect as much as they competed for championships. Now that the sport is finally breaking into the mainstream, they want the financial structure of the league to evolve with it. From their perspective, this negotiation isn't just about money. It's about recognition. Recognition of how far women's basketball has come. Recognition of the athletes who carried the league through its toughest years. And recognition that the WNBA is entering a new era where the sport deserves to be valued differently. But on the other side of the table, the owners see the situation through another lens. They see decades of investment. Years where the league operated without massive profits. Millions of dollars spent to keep teams running, arenas booked, and marketing campaigns active. From their perspective, the league's current growth is exciting, but it's also fragile. They believe the next era of the WNBA should be built carefully, ensuring that the business remains sustainable as it expands. In other words, both sides are fighting for what they believe is the future of the sport. Players want the growth to benefit the athletes immediately. Owners want to protect the stability that allows the league to keep growing. And somewhere between those two visions lies the compromise that will eventually shape the WNBA's next chapter. But the longer that compromise takes to appear, the more the pressure grows. Fans begin asking questions. Media outlets begin speculating about potential outcomes. Executives across the sports world begin watching closely. Because what happens inside the WNBA right now could influence the perception of women's professional sports for years to come. If the league navigates this moment successfully, it could prove that women's basketball has fully arrived as a powerful and sustainable professional sport. If the situation becomes chaotic, critics will inevitably try to use that chaos as evidence that the league still has obstacles to overcome. That's why the stakes feel so high. This isn't just about contracts. It's about credibility. And credibility is something every professional sports league must earn. Right now, the WNBA is closer than ever to securing its place among the most important sports organizations in the world. The fans are watching. The networks are watching. The sponsors are watching. And the players themselves are watching to see how the future of their league unfolds. But one thing is absolutely certain. The next agreement signed between the WNBA and its players won't just determine how the next season operates. It will determine how the next decade of women's basketball is built. And once that agreement is finally reached, the real story will begin. Because all of the momentum that has been building inside the WNBA will finally be free to move forward. The stars will take the court. The arenas will fill with fans. And the league will enter the most important era it has ever experienced. But until that moment arrives, the entire sports world is waiting to see how this story ends. When Ramona Shelburne spoke about the situation unfolding inside the WNBA, she didn't just reveal a difficult negotiation. She revealed a league standing at a crossroads. On one side is the momentum that has been building for years. Record viewership. New fans discovering the sport. Massive media partnerships preparing to broadcast the league to millions of people. On the other side is the challenge that every growing sports league eventually faces. How to divide success fairly between the people who play the game and the people who run the business. That question has shaped nearly every major sports league in the world. The NBA went through it. The NFL went through it. Major League Baseball went through it, and now the WNBA is facing its own version of that moment. The outcome of these negotiations will determine more than just player salaries. It will determine how the league's next chapter begins. Because the opportunity in front of the WNBA right now is enormous. The sport is growing, the audience is expanding, and the next generation of stars is ready to carry the league forward. But whether that growth continues smoothly or becomes more complicated depends on what happens next. The schedule is already set. The arenas are ready. The fans are waiting. Now the only thing left is for the people negotiating the future of the league to decide how this story moves forward. And when that decision finally arrives, it could define the next era of women's basketball. This story is still developing, and new details are coming out almost every week. If you want to stay updated on everything happening inside the WNBA, from breaking news to behind-the-scenes stories that most fans never hear about, make sure you subscribe to the channel, because the next few weeks could completely reshape the future of the league. And when the next major update drops, you'll want to know exactly what happened.